day in and day out, and it became known as what? Hanukkah, that's right. When you have nothing else to do, I encourage you to take some time to go to the Apocrypha and read through the books of the Maccabees, because in them you will learn a lot about that period in the 2nd century BC. I want to start with sort of a footnote, something that leapt out at me from the 4th chapter of 1st Maccabees. They were talking about the rededication of the temple, and the writer wrote in there, "Then they took unhewn stones, as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former. They rededicated the sanctuary and the interior of the temple, made new holy vestments, brought a new lampstand, altar of incense, and table into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar, lit lamps on the lampstand, and these gave light in the temple. Then they placed bread on the table and hung up curtains." You might say to me, why did that strike you as interesting? Well, the first layer at which it struck me as interesting, they took unhewn stones. In Mark chapter 13, Mark wrote, "Jesus was leaving the temple that day, and one of his disciples said, 'Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the wall.' And Jesus said, 'Yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another.'" I just got struck reading that portion of Maccabees by their desire to have unhewn stones for the rededication of the temple. And we've talked about Jesus coming as the embodiment of God, as the temple, and his comments years later that not one of these stones will be left on top of each other, because the temple will not be about the stones and the mortar. The second thing that struck me in there, which is pushing way further, was they hung up curtains. What happened in Matthew's gospel after Jesus died?
Curtain ripped in two.
Curtain was ripped in two. So it just sort of struck me that here we're talking about something 160 years before Jesus, and there are hints of stories that we hear a lot of. Anyway, back to the real world. At the time of the rededication of the temple, Antiochus, who was the king of the Seleucids, was in Persia, conquering more territory, and he received word that his garrison, that his troops in Judea had been defeated by the Hasmoneans. And so he did what any good king is going to do. He gathered his troops, his foot soldiers, and his elephants, and they made a forced march back to Jerusalem. In the midst of that forced march back to Jerusalem, Antiochus IV died. His brother Philip was appointed as the regent for his son, who would be Antiochus V. Now, at the time of the rededication, Judas didn't know, A, that Antiochus was trying to come back, and B, that he had subsequently died. But word got to people in Jerusalem loyal to Antiochus that all of this had happened. And the head of the garrison that was left in Jerusalem persuaded the young boy, Antiochus V, to grant the Jews religious freedom. And we read all about this in the first book of the Maccabees. But there was an agreement made. They came to terms with the Jews, made peace with them and all their nation, and agreed to let the Jews live by their laws, as they did before, because it was on account of their laws that we abolished that thing, and they became angry and did all of this. So, the Hasmoneans led Israel to a great victory and a small measure of independence in the middle of the 2nd century BC. That small measure of independence, that small sense of we're back to being a nation, was aided by the steady decline of the Seleucid Empire, which would be Syria. Okay? And that empire was declining under steady attacks from the Roman Republic, which was on the ascendancy, and an empire called the Parthians, which was a small empire that was emerging to the east of Judea. Now, another piece of trivia. Does anybody know of a famous passage in the New Testament where somebody wrote about, and they heard it in their own tongues, Medes, Edomites, Parthians?
Oh, it's something you've read.
I'm sorry, Kate. You had a great answer, but I like his a lot better. Oh, that was good, Dick. That was very good. Pentecost. In that story in Acts, when they talk about the Spirit descending, Luke wrote, and they heard it in their own languages. And one of the people that heard it were the Parthians. The Parthians were somewhat descendants of our friends the Assyrians, which means they weren't necessarily the nicest people in the entire world at the time. Sorry, GB.
I know all about it.
One of the things for us to remember as we are moving past the middle of the 2nd century is 100 years before, when Alexander the Great had conquered this entire area. Under him, many, many cultures, nations, and religions were simultaneously under the influence of a single culture, the Greek culture. This is almost 100 years later, and the sole survivor of all of those cultures and nations and religions that had been under the influence of the Greek culture and Alexander the Great, sole survivor right now as a nation, culture, religion, is Judaism. Okay, so the king is dead. The king of the Seleucids is dead. His son has a regent, but his son also has a much older brother named Demetrius. Demetrius will go to Rome, since Rome is on the ascendancy, and ask to be restored to the Seleucid throne. Rome rejected his request because the Romans aren't stupid. They know that they can do more in this area if there's a boy as king than they can if there's a 25-year-old as king. Not only did they say no, but they were smart enough to detain Demetrius in Rome. In 161, Antiochus V, the boy king, his position was greatly weakened because Rome sank his ships. They not only sank his ships, but they went so far as to hamstring the elephants that he used for his cavalry. Why did they do this to him? Because he, through his regent, was amassing weapons. Like I said, Rome's on the ascendancy, but they're not stupid. Demetrius escapes from his confinement in Rome, and he makes a beeline across the Mediterranean back into the Middle East and claims the throne. Antiochus V may be a boy, but he's a rival. And Demetrius immediately killed him and the regent. So now, we have on the throne Demetrius I, who will become infamous in Jewish history. In large part because in 160 BC, he killed Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus, of course, was the Hasmonean who restored the temple after it had been profaned. He killed him in battle. Demetrius was not to be long-lived. Another person named Alexander Ballas presented himself as a son of the former king Antiochus, the old king Antiochus. And he went out and raised himself an army, and he landed in a city up in northern Israel and established a rival kingdom. Indeed, around 150 BC, he reigned as a rival king of the Seleucids. So now, this empire that is declining now has two kings. Each contender wanted the Jews as an ally. Alexander Ballas appointed Jonathan, a member of the Hasmonean family, as the high priest. Now, Jonathan was the brother of Judas Maccabeus. And as such, Judas had been high priest, and as such, he was an heir. Jonathan took the title. Now, remember, the Hasmoneans are Levites. They are not from the descendancy of Zadok the priest. They are not Aaronic priests. They are Levites. And you remember several weeks ago we talked about the introduction of the Levite priesthood superseding the descendancy of Zadok and the descendancy of Aaron. So Jonathan accepted Alexander Ballas's title, but his acceptance of the title of high priest was no more legal under the law of Moses than about 150 years prior when Menelaus did the exact same thing dealing with the Persian king. So, Demetrius sent a letter to Jonathan granting the Jews even more privileges. However, the Jews didn't believe Demetrius because he had persecuted the Jews in the past. And so the Jews sided with Alexander Ballas and killed Demetrius I. That meant that Alexander Ballas took full control of the throne of Syria. And then he made an important alliance with Egypt by marrying a certain person named Cleopatra. Jonathan dies, and he is succeeded by his brother, Simon, as high priest. Simon goes one step further. Simon declares himself high priest and governor of Judea forever. He said that the high priesthood shall pass forever from him to all of his descendants. Do you get the sense right now, about 150 years before the birth of Jesus, you get the sense that the Jews are really struggling to know who they are and to figure out where on earth is God? Yeah.
I have a question. This was following along this, and you said like it had survived over all cultures and stuff for so long. And like, why? Like, since where was the revelation of God for how long has it been since like before the exile? Like, this doesn't seem like, why would they even hold on to this religion? I mean, what was the draw?
I think part of the draw was in the telling of the stories, which we'll find out either late today or at the beginning of next week. This is the period when people not only have told the stories, but now they're really going to begin to write them down so that they can actually be shared with the dispersed community.
It's just hard to fathom because I can imagine right after the Exodus, people would be like, wow, look at the Exodus, you know, the power of that. And you know, I've seen that in some of the stories right afterwards where people were influenced by the Exodus because it was real, it was a revelation then. But then myself, if there was a story back then, it's like, so yeah, that happened, but you know, it seems like it would lose power over time.
Well, but you have to understand, they also recognize at this point, they've got close to 2,000 years of the power of these stories. And they've got 2,000 years of stories in which, well, maybe God wasn't totally present, maybe his voice wasn't really heard, and then his voice was heard, and then maybe it wasn't, and then his voice was heard, and then all of a sudden we're in exile, but now we're back, and then it's defamed, but we've restored it. I mean, it's an ebb and a flow.
It just doesn't seem since the exile that there's been that much gripping stuff, but I wasn't there.
But I think part of what we also have to bear in mind is life is a lot simpler. And the power of a story, let me say it differently for a Western mind. When you told stories around a campfire out in the plains about life back in Massachusetts as you're heading west, okay? They were incredibly powerful stories for everybody in that wagon train to hear. They defined who you were, even though you were afraid tomorrow morning you'd get up and the Indians were going to come shooting at you. Those stories held you together and gave you some grounding. And I think that part of the struggle of the Jews as we push towards 0000 is the stories have a power. The world around them isn't doing the exact same thing.
I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is this is a period of time when religion and politics and national identity are all wrapped up in one thing. And so to ask how could they continue to hold on to God would be asking how could they continue to be Jewish? How could they continue to be the people that they are? It's like asking how could Americans not be American? Or any other group of people, except that in the case of Israel and many of the other religions of that period of time, politics and national identity were so closely wrapped up with religion as to be indistinguishable. Mm-hmm. And so they're going through the motions, if you will, of reading these stories and telling these stories. I don't think they're just going through the motions. They really do mm-hmm. long for God to return. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it would have occurred to anyone in that period of time, why are we listening to these stories?
Right.
Why are we continuing to do this? It's like, why am I still white? I don't want to be white anymore.
I don't know, why are you?
Well, I'm trying to use an analogy of it's just not the kind of question that would have occurred
right.
to people.
Right.
But did some people question it and then go towards the pagan gods? I mean, in overtime. I mean, I think you said a couple of weeks ago that some people.
But a lot of
But
that
they
was
weren't
motivated
questioning.
by politics.
Right. They weren't questioning. They were looking at survival. In other words, when I can't think of who it was. I think it was last week's class when the one guy, Jason, was appointed the high priest, and he wanted to build gymnasiums and have Jewish boys study in the gymnasiums, which would be studying in the nude, studying the Greek language. That was survival. That was, hey, I can play your game. I can play with this culture. When they went to Babylon, they made concessions. When the northern kingdom went off with the Assyrians, they had to make concessions. But they made concessions in order that they would continue to either be the Hebrew people as they were before, or the Jews as they would call themselves post-exile.
And those concessions, though, let's think about that a little bit more, because that continued to anger many Jews.
And it did.
And as we go through time, we end up with these groups like the Essenes.
Mhm. And the Pharisees,
Or the
and the Sadducees.
Pharisees, who at one level are reactionary groups to this kind of concession. So they became even more entrenched in their religion, and more entrenched in their culture, and more entrenched in their national identity because of these corrupt leaders
Yeah.
taking them away.
Now, okay, Simon is now the high priest and the governor forever. You notice he's governor, not king. Okay? He was a good ruler. He strengthened the coffers of Judea. He raised the dignity of the priesthood. He increased trade, and he set out to create a more just environment for the Jews. He struck up peace treaties with Rome and with Syria, but that peace would not be long-lasting. In 135 BC, Simon and his son would be killed by his son-in-law. He had another son who managed to escape that assassination, and that son, whose name was John Hyrcanus, assumed the office of high priest and governor forever, and he would rule from 135 to 105 BC. He was required to pay tribute to the Syrian king, but the Syrian king died shortly thereafter, so he stopped paying. In that vacuum, John Hyrcanus extended the boundaries of Judea by conquering territory. He went east towards Jordan, and he went north towards Shechem, and conquered the Samaritans. Have you noticed that the Samaritans don't go away? They just keep coming back up in our discussions. Okay? Again, all of this is background when you think about the story of the Good Samaritan. All of these relations, or lack thereof, between the Jews and the Samaritans. Key point. All right. John Hyrcanus would exact a savage revenge on the Samaritans because they remained aloof during the Maccabean revolt back in 167 to 165 BC. The Samaritans would have nothing to do with it because they were hostile towards the Greeks and they were hostile towards the Jews. They didn't want to have anything to do with anybody. But now that John Hyrcanus is in office, he is going to exact a savage revenge against them. He would build fortresses to be able to keep them in line. Now, another important development in these 20 years of John Hyrcanus, and that is a transferring of sympathies from the popular Pharisees to the noble Sadducees. John Hyrcanus, when he came into office, had been under the influence of the Pharisees. Now you remember, about 100 years before, we talked about the Hasidim and how the Pharisees and the Essenes wanted to ensure that there was a pious branch within Judaism. Somebody had to ensure that Jews were pious and knew what the law said and knew what the scriptures said. All right. Well, post-Maccabean revolt, the upper crust, within the upper crust, emerged a group that were called the Sadducees. When John Hyrcanus came to office in 135 BC, he began to assume a royal status very much like that of the Sadducees. Indeed,
Very much like this.
hmm?
A royal status, very much like.
The Sadducees.
Okay. Royal? They're royal. You said no. Okay. Sorry.
The Sadducees presented themselves as the ruling class. John Hyrcanus presented himself as a member of the ruling class. However, to a pious Jew, there was only one royal class among Jews, and they would be the descendants of David. So all the posturing by the Sadducees and others parts of the upper class, the Pharisees found offensive. In addition, the Pharisees believed that the high priesthood was being profaned by worldly ambition. And at the heart of the profanation of it was the Hasmonean family. At this time, pushing towards the turn of the century, turn of the second into the first century, the Essenes withdrew deeper and deeper into the desert. They found the state of affairs within the political/religious world of Judaism to be utterly unacceptable.
Agreed.
Hmm?
Agreed.
And the priesthood was no longer being led by the descendants of Zadok and Aaron. There were members of the priestly line that should have been the high priest who weren't the high priest, and the Essenes said, that's it. But they not only said that's it, they said, we're out of here and we are just not going to stick around with you guys anymore. The Pharisees would stick around. The
Is it
Hasmoneans.
worth mentioning that the Essene community was trying to bring the reign of God by their behavior?
Yeah,
by their
yes, oh, yes.
observance of Torah?
Yes.
That by being that strict, sort of monastic before there was
Right.
monasticism, that it would usher in the kingdom of God.
Right. In the meantime, bear in mind, Hasmoneans thought that they were moving towards ushering in the reign of God. Okay? But for many Jews, the Hasmoneans had become too worldly. The greatness and the glory of John Hyrcanus as high priest and governor, in some circles, raised hope for a priestly ruler Messiah to arise who would be a descendant of Levi. But in other quarters, as Ben just pointed out, that wasn't going to happen under these circumstances. In 105 BC, John Hyrcanus dies. And this, let me tell you, the next 100 years, we're going to do them as a hop, skip, and a jump, and if you're confused, that's fine. But you need to understand the hop, skip, and the jump because there's a lot of players that are going to come into place in the next 100 years that you will hear about in Luke 2 and their relationship to the time in which Jesus is born. So John dies. He has a son named Aristobulus who becomes the high priest. He proclaims himself the king of the Jews. Yeah, right, good laugh. He's no dummy. Aristobulus proclaims himself the king of the Jews abroad. So tells Rome, he tells Syria, he tells everybody abroad, I'm the king of the Jews. He was not so vocal at home. For the reason that I mentioned a minute ago, and that is that for some people, the only king of the Jews is going to be what? Who?
From the line of David.
Right there. From the line of David.
Well,
Yes.
It's a Greek name.
Oh, well, but remember we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that with the rise of Alexander, a lot of Jews would adopt Greek names and would not use their Hebrew names. And many of them are written up in history using the Greek name because that's the name that they had as governor or king or whatever. I don't remember Aristobulus's, I want to say it was Mattathias, but I'm not sure about that. But he had a Hebrew name that he did use. Oh, no, it was Judas. Because at home, on the coins, it didn't say Aristobulus, it said Judas as the high priest. He would reign for 1 year. But in that 1 year, he would conquer Galilee. And he would proselytize a largely Gentile population in Galilee. People who were Syrian and or Greek. He would proselytize them and he would demand that all men had to be circumcised. All had to obey Jewish law. Now, who came out of Galilee?
Jesus.
Ah, thank you, Dick. Jesus. Not to mention Peter, Andrew, James, John. Again, comes into the picture 100 BC. Okay? Now, Aristobulus caused the death of his brother Antigonus at the instigation of his wife shortly before Aristobulus would die. He had another brother. You see, you thought this was only written in the Enquirer and you would only read about this while you stood at the checkout line, right? Wrong. Go read the Maccabees.
Can I ask a really quick question, hopefully? When you said he proselytized there, is that unique? Because, I mean, that was initially to be a light to other people. I mean, but as Ben said, it was like a national identity. How much were they actually bringing new converts in?
Well, this was a new development within Judaism.
So that's a new thing.
Right. I mean, when they were in Babylon, well, you know, one might loosely say they proselytized. They married everybody around them. You know, there was all that intermarriage, both with those who stayed at home and with those who were abroad. But what's important here is Judaism was, they were to be the people of God.
Right.
And in that covenant relationship. And here, you know, we've got this high priest who's going out into Galilee and saying, we've conquered you, you're male,
So he was
meet our moyam.
the first evangelical Jew.
Yeah, maybe. But that's kind of,
I think the key word is conquer.
conquer, yeah.
So he was more into the political aspect than the
Again, political.
But conversion is a new thing, though.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes,
it used
yes.
to be swipe them out, obliterate them from this land, which is now ours. And this
This
making them, yeah.
is different. Okay, so Aristobulus is dead. He's killed off one of his brothers, but he's got another brother. And that brother's name is Alexander Janus. He's going to rule for about 30 years, until about 75 BC. He was ambitious to complete all of his father's conquests in northern Palestine. And he succeeded in 96 BC by acquiring Gaza. Again, we think Gaza is only in the news in the last 40 years. Gaza has been in the news since 96 BC, back and forth and back and forth. All right? He also pushed further into Jordan. Multiple wars would lead to multiple scars. And there is some suggestion among scholars that Psalm 2 was written around this time, 100 to 95 BC, with Alexander Janus trying to continue his father's conquests. Psalm 2 writes, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of earth set themselves and rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make nations your heritage, and ends of earth your possession. You shall break them with rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling. Kiss his feet, or he will be angry, and you will perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him. Alexander Janus would have lots of problems at home with the Pharisees. They viewed him as disreputable. Their zeal was the law of Moses and Jewish institutions. They did not desire war or glory for their own sake. The Pharisees voiced concern about the legality of the Hasmonean claim to power. But because of the Hasmoneans' deep tie that had developed over the last 50 years with the Sadducees and with other upper-class families in Jerusalem, the Hasmoneans continued to rule. In 76-75 BC, Alexander Janus died. The high priesthood went to his son. The crown went to his widow and his brother's widow.
That's like brand new.
That's like what?
Brand new, like.
A whole new set of realities. I mean, David wasn't necessarily monogamous, so.
Well, no, but I mean, now you've got ladies with.
You've got ladies with the crown, and you've got the son as the high priest. The queen, from 78 to 69, the dominant queen, shall we say, was Salome. She was viewed as a wise and pious ruler. She gave the Pharisees wide control over internal affairs, but she handled foreign policy. You can just imagine this didn't make the Sadducees very happy. So they looked to Alexander Janus' son, Aristobulus, for leadership. The Sadducees controlled the fortresses throughout Judea. Salome was aging. She wanted to leave the throne to her oldest son, whose name was Hyrcanus. But the Sadducees sided with Aristobulus. He raised an army to attack Mom, except she died.
There was no love between these families.
Not at the moment. Aristobulus II would reign for 6 years. Hyrcanus would retire from the scene, at least for the moment. However, through intrigue, an Idumean, meaning a descendant of Esau. Remember Esau? Way back when?
He gave up his whatever
Right.
was to.
A descendant of Esau, an Idumean, whose name was Antipater, persuaded Hyrcanus to come out of retirement and claim the throne and the high priesthood of his brother. The plan worked well. Aristobulus II was defeated, and of course, made the Pharisees a little happier. In the midst of all of this, nobody's dead, just defeated. In the midst of all of this, both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus appeal to Rome for help. Now, Rome now has a stronghold from Rome all the way to the Euphrates, and they're trying to continue to go east. So they're very much in the region. Rome gave their support to Aristobulus. At which point, everybody, Antipater with Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus II, and the Pharisees all send ambassadors to Pompey, who was the governor in Damascus in 63 BC. The Pharisees advocated that Pompey, i.e. Rome, not listen to either one of these would-be high priests, but instead Pompey assumed the governance of this area himself, abolished the monarchy completely, and only allow theocratic rule by priests. There was a lot of posturing at the time. Pompey would end up imprisoning Aristobulus II, and he would be able to enter Jerusalem with his troops because Antipater and Hyrcanus opened the gates and let him come in.
So this was the original separation of church and politics?
Don't get carried away.
Oh,
We're not separated yet, honey. Aristobulus II had troops in the city, and they retreated to the Temple Mount, and there was a siege in Jerusalem. It would last for 3 months in 63 BC, and Pompey would be successful, and 12,000 Jews would be slaughtered in Jerusalem. Pompey would profane the temple by entering the Holy of Holies. He would remove the treasures, and then when he was done, he ordered that the temple be rededicated yet again. Aristobulus II was taken to Rome. Hyrcanus was allowed to function as the high priest and governor, but not as king. This marks the real end of the Hasmonean dynasty, because now Judea must pay tribute to Rome because Pompey is there running the show. Now, we'll pick it up next week, but I will give you a tease for next week, and the tease is Antipater, who is siding with Hyrcanus, becomes the father of a certain king of Judea. Anybody have any wild guesses? We're 63 BC. Anybody have any wild guesses as to who that might be?
The Great, yes.
Antipater is the father of Herod the Great.
Huh.
So we are fast coming to all of those stories that we hear year in and year out at the end of December, and they're all tied to everything that we've been discussing all semester. Questions?
Going back a little bit to the beginning of your talk,
Mm-hmm.
where Jesus said that there wouldn't be one stone on another. Is the Wailing Wall part of the original, or the first temple?
Second temple.
Second temple, okay.
Nothing remained of the Solomonic
Okay,
temple. So the Wailing Wall is the post-exilic temple.
okay, but that wasn't what he was talking about, he was talking about,
Well, see, he was making much more of a theological statement, but it just struck me that, here was all this concern about these unhewn stones, and then Jesus comes along and says, stones don't matter, in essence.
so what was the point of defiling the whole temple if you're only going to rededicate it 5 days later, it seems like?
Can any of us explain the plunders of war?
Power. I mean, isn't
Power is one of them.
power move?
But what I'm getting at is, Lots of things happen in war. It's a small example, but next to last episode of Band of Brothers, when they are just plundering that town in Bavaria, you know, and they're pulling everything out of people's homes, and they're taking stuff out of the china shops and all like this. Were they basically good people? Were they basically good men in easy company? I don't think so, but it was war. Doesn't justify it, don't get me wrong, doesn't justify it, but I've never been in war, I cannot explain how.
I think it went deeper in it, it's a form of humiliation.
Yeah, it's a,
Yeah, okay.
it's a visual humiliation.
Yeah, it's a basic way of saying, you
Yeah,
know, you are done for.
yeah.
You have no power whatsoever. Even your God's been defeated.
Right.
Yeah, it's a polytheistic, it comes from that, just our God's greater than your God.
Isn't there a song? Our God is great.
There's a lot. Not all from the same perspective.
As a soldier, I don't want to
All right, next week, we're gonna cruise through Julius Caesar, Herod, all that good stuff, right into 00000000. You didn't think I was gonna get there. I know you didn't think I was ever gonna get there.